right, everybody. I am super excited today to kick off March 1st here at the Inevitable World Summit, broadcasting live to you where I'm sitting from the World's Fair Expo 2020 in Dubai, which is actually happening in 2022 for all the obvious reasons. And I'm here today with the gentleman who is 50% of the reason why any of us even have an industry today. Scott Stornetta, welcome to the platform again, sir. Super great to see you. And I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have to bring people up to speed on the prehistory of blockchain, the present history, and then what you see as the future and your hopes for the future of this industry that is now in the multiple trillions. Thanks to your vision and your execution with Mr. Haber 30 some years ago. So welcome to the platform.
Thank you, Chris. And again, a pleasure to be back being interviewed by you. I know whenever we do something that you're coming in well-informed, and yet you still have a little bit of an edge that you're willing to push things. So I know we'll have an interesting interview here.
So October 13th, which is 5 days before my birthday, not that anybody cares about that, but October 13th of 1991 was a very important day in history because 30 years ago, this past October, you and Haber did something special. Talk to us about what happened on October 13th, 1991, and let's talk about the prehistory of blockchain before Bitcoin, because most people are aware of blockchain, if at all, because of Satoshi and because of Bitcoin, but context is everything. And 3 of the 8 references, if I'm not mistaken, in Satoshi's famous now peer-reviewed white paper were Mr. Haber and yourself. And so you are the undisputed godfathers of what we now know as the blockchain or crypto industry. And you're super humble at the same time. But October 13th, 91, what happened?
Sure. So many people, of course, are familiar with the contribution that Satoshi Nakamoto has made. I don't mean to take anything away from him. It was a brilliant contribution. And he began a blockchain with a Genesis block. Okay. But what people don't often understand is that the original blockchain began with a Genesis block back on that date that you cited in 1991. And that has been in continuous publication, continuous extension of that blockchain for 30 years now. Go ahead. So,
and I'm going to interject if I may, not because I want you to keep your flow, but I don't want to skip anything here because we got people watching from all different kinds of knowledge base. And so blockchain, for a lot of people, they've heard of it, they don't know what it is, right? Blockchain, the easiest way I kind of explain it, which isn't to a 5-year-old, but makes sense, is a tamper-evident storage medium with a decentralized consensus mechanism, a way to find truth without a centralized authority. So, and it's tamper-evident. Now, you teach courses on this at Columbia University. You do a brilliant thing where you help people, and I watched my parents do it at the QS Capitol building when we met a couple of years ago, who had never known anything about blockchain, but immediately understood it. You show people how blockchain works in a lot of the works and keynotes that you do. But what is a Genesis block? Because some people may or may not know that. And for those who do, let's remind them of why this was such a novel idea in 1991.
Well, first of all, you have to picture 1991. This is the era of dial-up internet, just for people that are just exploring the space. This is, AOL 1200 baud modems and super speeds. And yet we could still implement a blockchain. Now, let me talk about what that means. We could create a widely distributed, decentralized, in essence, a database, a publicly viewable ledger or record of all the transactions that were occurring. And because it was widely distributed, and because each block of information was linked to the next block of information, we created a system that, with all the world in effect viewing the records and a very widely distributed set of records that people could hold, there was really no way for anyone to try to make alteration to the record without it immediately being obvious to the entire audience of participants. And this really is the start of decentralized record keeping and consensus in a way that we so increase the confidence we can have in the trust of that record. Now, where does the notion of a Genesis block fit into this? Well, if the blockchain is a sequence of blocks linked together, it has to start somewhere. And at the time, in a kind of pre-internet, pre-World Wide Web sort of world, it really was called into question how to issue these blocks in a way that a very wide audience could view and know that the trust was untouchable, untamperable, without it immediately being evident. And so in addition to individual parties holding these key blocks, which is the way that Bitcoin works, we sort of used a belt and suspenders approach. And what that meant was that we picked a publication, namely the national edition of the New York Times, okay, which had a circulation of 500,000 or whatever at the time, and was held in effectively every major library throughout the world. We published the Genesis block in a simple ad in the New York Times.
So you literally ran a classified ad because the internet basically barely existed. And again, just like the Berlin Wall was like 18 months from being torn down. This was truly the beginning of what became the information age and where we moved out of industrial age. But we're talking about that was a concept. It wasn't a thing yet, right? I mean, 91, we're still years away from Tim Berners-Lee's contribution of the World Wide Web, right? And we're still away, I believe, from hypertext protocol being, invented, or it was in the works maybe. So the reality is that there was no other way to distribute it. So you literally created a blockchain, which now, lives and is the internet, like moves the internet of money and all this stuff. And yet you distribute it by placing a classified ad proving it in the world.
The internet was so fledgling. I mean, it existed at some level. World Wide Web, that's a little later. But there was an ability to distribute amongst a small number of people that well understood protocols and whatnot. But it wasn't nearly universal enough. And so we said, we've got to find some way to anchor this system in something that any person at all, pretty much in the world, if they could make it to a library, they could see the proof. And that was part of the whole concept of the entire world serving as a witness to the record.
So I have to back up and ask one clear question too, because again, the foresight here, known or unknown at the time by you and Stuart, the foresight here is incredible to me because again, we're some of us are familiar with things like the Cypherpunk Manifesto in the mid to late 90s. I think that was 96, 97, somewhere in there. Some of these seminal kind of works of, to your point, the early adopters of these protocols, the early inventors of these protocols that have connected us all at scale, right? And literally changed the shape of the world the last 30 years. And yet a fundamental problem of how records would be kept, verified, transacted in a world that didn't even get invented yet, you guys solved before this. And I'm just like curious on the behalf of everybody, like, what was the problem set? Like, how come you guys attacked this problem in 91 to the point where you brought it into an executable thing where a Genesis block was actually rendered? Because you had to have been able to somehow foresee a need for it at scale in the future. And yet the things that would drive that need had not been invented for another 4 or 5 years.
Right. And so I guess my answer is two-part. One part is, well, we did have some real foresight for some things, but the other part is better lucky than smart. And part of it was the opportunity that we had to do research in this area. Namely, I had just come from working, very fortunately for myself, as a grad student at Stanford, but also jointly at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox PARC. I had a desk there because I had an advisor there. And I felt like it gave me an opportunity to see what the future was going to be like, okay? Because at Xerox PARC, as you know, many very creative people had invented a lot of the technologies that we would be seeing down the road, a lot of the distributed computing, the fully networked systems, the bitmapped graphics, the object-oriented program. And so you felt when you went into Xerox PARC that you were living in a little bubble that was maybe 10 years fast forwarded into the future. And it was that provided a stimulus to me that said, the day is coming when we're all going to be connected, when we're all going to be using digital records, and we won't really have any way fundamentally to know whether we can trust the digital records amongst all the parties that are dealing with them on the internet. And so it was this kind of obsession on my part to say, how are we going to build a trustworthy digital record? And the opportunity came when I graduated with my PhD to move from Stanford to the East Coast to work at a part of the old Bell Labs system, Bell Communications Research. And that's where I met Dr. Stuart Haber, who was an expert in cryptography, what they would have called crypto at the time, long before crypto came to mean a digital asset or a cryptocurrency. And I just said, this future is coming fast, but people are not worrying about the problem they're going to need to worry about. So why don't we try to tackle this problem before the rest of the world realizes how important the problem is going to be? And that way we can get a jump on the people that are really smart and, maybe make a contribution before everybody realizes how important this issue is, and then kind of steal the opportunity away from us. So that was our motivation.
So the Genesis block was a big date in time. It was the first ever time a blockchain had the opportunity to exist, and it wasn't a chain yet; it was a block. But then there could be a chain onto that.
It's still create the second block.
And if I recall, this is the longest run. This blockchain still exists. It's still out there minting blocks.
It's been running continuously for over 30 years now. This is the 30th anniversary year.
So this is the again, because it's fully transparent and immutable, this is the longest running blockchain in the history of humanity. And you guys brought it forth through the New York Times of all places with a classified ad back on that date in 1991. And so what was the next milestone? Like once you did that, then you kind of had cracked part of the problem, which was how we're going to make something tamper evident and yet deal with consensus. And so you had started to create a solution set. What was the next kind of key moment in time, or the key paper or patent that kind of formed off of that advanced it? What was the next timeline that really stood out?
Sure. And again, I'm happy to respond, but I do again want to point out that our mechanisms were quite primitive compared to what you see today, but you can already see the basic outline of what we think of as modern blockchains in the distributed, the consensus building, the tamper evident nature of things. And for us, it started out with that, and then it was about making the system much more efficient. And who would have thought about making a system more efficient? Because we still wrestle with that problem, the scalability issue. Everyone's, thinks that it's important to work on this so-called trilemma. Well, we worried about it, early days. That's what led to the incorporation of Merkle trees and whatnot. And we also worried about the long-term survivability and reliability of the system. And it's one reason why that next breakthrough was running a pair of hash functions in parallel, so that if one were to break, we could swap out the old and swap in a new while still being able to count on the other. Kind of like the reason that you have a double layer tank in gas tanks that are buried at service stations, because when the first tank is breached, it sets off a sensor that tells you it's time to replace part of the tank before it contaminates the ground outside. That's why you have a double layer. And this was that same notion that this way, when the first hash function is compromised, the record integrity can continue. You have time to swap in a new. And so we thought that was a major step forward. And then if I can just fast forward a little bit more, the next big thing was to really start moving from just an index of the records, which was all we had contained in the so-called blockchain to begin with, and then start to identify parts of the records and give them meaning. This is really the first inklings of a true distributed ledger, where the on-chain content matters as much as the off-chain content. And that in itself led to something that, again, says a little bit about a three-letter acronym. I don't know whether we should say that acronym or not, or save that for later in the interview. But the unique identification of locations on the blockchain and giving them we
can start moving there now. I think because you made a clarification that I'm glad you did, because I want to clarify myself. We're talking a lot about blockchain, and the main reason we're saying blockchain is because that's what people associate with this industry, and kind of that's the nomenclature. Much like you said earlier, crypto has now become digital asset or currency in most people's minds, but it's really about cryptography, right? And that's where it started. But what it's known for is different now. Blockchain is a distributed ledger technology, and your goal was not, and you didn't state in 1991 that we've invented blockchain. What you had invented was a distributed ledger technology, a new way of arriving at consensus that was decentralized. And that was a novel and totally new way of doing things. And you mentioned Merkle trees, and there's things like Hashgraph. And there's all these things that have kind of spun out as better ways or different ways to solve decentralization or distributed ledger technology and consensus. So that innovation that has happened on top of Haber and Stornetta's kind of breakthrough innovation is what usually happens when something is out there in the wild, right? Is that people start to find even better ways to make it more efficient, or to do things differently, or to add this feature set. So again, this isn't about, a goal wasn't to come up with something called blockchain. You rendered a block, it became a chain, but really what you did was a distributed ledger technology, and we're the first to do it, and that is still running. And then what we're getting to, the next acronym, as you thought about what could be in the chain or on the chain versus off chain, things like, well, what can we put into containers? Or what if we put tokens, which is a container? What if we tokenized things of value and we put them on the chain, regardless of what they were? If we could do that, that could impact other industries or solve problems for other industries. And then there was this notion of fungible, right? Things that are interswappable, and then non-fungible, one-of-ones, things that are truly one-of-ones and unique. And so fast forward to April 1st, 1997, again, the prehistory of Bitcoin, blockchain before Bitcoin, right? 1997, now the World Wide Web is in its infancy. Amazon is formed, PayPal is formed, billions of dollars are being thrown at startups with .com behind it. Nothing to do with decentralization or with blockchain yet. However, that world that you predicted and that you foresaw through other people's foresights was connecting at a bigger and bigger scale. That was coming true. And right. In 97, the first ever time a non-fungible location, which I want you to talk about, now known as the three-letter word NFT, non-fungible token, on a distributed ledger was published in a peer-reviewed paper, which is different than a white paper. I'll let you clarify why. On April 1st. So literally April 1st, 1997, another key date and time. So what happened that date?
Well, again, you've made reference to the tokens, the fungible tokens, which are the essence of a money supply. And I do want to be clear yet again that we're not claiming credit for having the innovation that of handling cryptocurrencies on the blockchain. But we did come to understand that even though you could register things, in time on a blockchain, that there was something more that could be done, that you could start talking about unique locations on the blockchain. And that really underlies the notion of the non-fungible location, The notion that you could take an ordinary document that could be copied many times over, but you could assert for the public record that this particular location is where the first instance of this is being attached. And it gave that location a unique status compared to any copies that you would make of this same document, that this is the owner's location, so to speak, the first time it appears, and it's widely accepted as being that location and having that meaning. I'm simply saying that was what was in that, part of what was in that next set of paper and patent, that when you look at it, retrospectively, you realize that that's moving towards that NFT concept, that that those unique locations.
And so why does a non-fungible, let's just talk about again, back in 97, why did a non-fungible location, and we'll talk about what a location is versus a token, like just because I think it's informative, but why did a non-fungible location on a decentralized or a distributed ledger technology, a record, why did that matter in your mind? Why was that something that would be important in the future from your perspective? What was the awareness or the insight that said, well, we could put a copy of a thing? Like, what was that?
Right. So the concern in part was that, again, this was a world more primitive, the one we live in now, where we thought the bulk of records would be off-chain, but that they would be tied into the blockchain, if you will, by their hash value, not by having the entire record on chain. But the concern is, if you wanted to pull a fake, you could just register two different records, slightly different, onto the blockchain. And if no one is really looking through all of the entries, you could pick whichever one is more favorable to you as time goes on, okay? And so there had to be this notion of, no, this location is the unique and official location for this sort of document. And any other claims that this was the document that appear anywhere else, built into this.
So a simple real world example of fast forward to today, because something we can all understand, something that isn't new, which is a driver's license, which has personal information on it about the person who's been issued it. So I have a driver's license, you have a driver's license or an identification. And on there are things like your birth date or my birth date, your address, whether you live there still or not, but whatever the address was when you lived there. And so these become sources of verification. And these are real world government issued documents or company issued documents. These are things that matter to a certain use case. And in a world where we have to now bank online or we have to call things and change our cable bill or whatever, and someone goes, well, I need to verify a couple of things, Mr. Snook or Mr. Stornetta. You envision that, if there was a thing where on chain, I could just know that it's right. But I don't have to store all the data. That would be more efficient, because if Chris needs to be 21 to enter a bar, I don't need to know his birthday. I just need to know he's over 21. And the less data that's out there would be a safer world, right? Because the less data that's out there, the less risk of faking an ID or defrauding someone or stealing their identity, things like that, right? So real world utilities that just go, if we could use this decentralized technology and we could use a non-fungible location to say, swarm protocols be damned, meaning the most popular one doesn't matter. What matters is the most accurate one.
Right.
And this is a way to do it.
This is the unique location where the true Chris Snook owned information is. Okay? Right. Any other location that claims to be the Chris Snook data is not acceptable. This is the one and only uniquely bound to Chris Snook location. And we're making that statement to everyone that witnesses it.
So these are things that, again, these happened before the .com bubble burst. This is now 97. There was a Bitstamps peer-reviewed paper that's widely available. There was associated patents that essentially were patents written around the first non-fungible location on a decentralized ledger. There was foreshadowing in that paper, as well as those patents related to decentralized storage of data, which things like IPFS and other things that now people are widely aware of, like literally became reality, but these things were foreshadowed in that. And then there was obviously the use of a decentralized ledger for this kind of thing. And that was 97. And then what happened between then and, Satoshi on October 31st, 2008, like what happened? Anything big happened between that and the prehistory of blockchain before Bitcoin, plodding along, incremental things? What happened between then and there, 97 to 08?
Thing, and this goes to the old joke about overnight successes that are 10 and 20 years in the making, is that there was a tremendous explosion of the amount of connectivity in the world. and the increase in individual compute power available on your desktop. And so you're starting to see the world envisioned by some of these, cypherpunk works become practical. Namely, individuals suddenly, well, I say suddenly, but gradually came to possess the necessary compute power.
Mm-hmm.
And enough individuals were able to have peer-to-peer connectivity as people pile into the internet, that finally we start to really feel like there's a society here that is fully connected and has substantial compute power at the individual user node level. Okay. All of that presages the ability to create a Bitcoin. An enormous increase as well over these, this sort of lost decade, if you're, trying to push it that way.
I wasn't pushing it. I was actually not sure. So I wasn't pushing it.
I think it's the proper narrative to push. It feels like not much is happening, but all of these foundational blocks that are going to be necessary are in fact ramping up. Increased compute power at the individual node level, increased connectivity peer-to-peer, increased storage capacity, increased bandwidth to transmit records. And all of that is what made it possible to create a record where a substantial amount of information is on-chain and yet expected to be replicated across 10,000 or whatever nodes. Again, the analogy I would draw is if Stuart and I had gone to our bosses at Bell Communications Research and said, hey, we figured out this clever way to do X. There's only one small problem. It requires all the users on the system to have a terabyte drive.
Right.
And for us to be able to transmit gigabits, gigabytes over the network on a routine basis, all pushed through our 1,200 baud modems.
I'll push through a phone that they have in their hand. Right. Like you would have been like, no way.
They would have said, that's like telling me that you figured out how to get to the moon by climbing a really tall tree.
Right.
It's
I think, the narrative, I'm glad you pushed back on that, because I think we should push the narrative a little bit and see where it goes. I like the idea of that was a lost decade. 97 to 08 was a lost decade. Not in the sense of nothing was happening, but in the sense of nothing was obvious to those looking on, right? It's that notion of slowly, then suddenly the entire thing shifts and you go, what the hell happened? And it was happening the whole time. You just didn't know what to look at. But, to your point, when we think about these things, we had 01, we had these massive geopolitical things. We had Patriot Act. We had the data economy becoming exponentially bigger than oil, whether it had materialized into that or not, right? But the infrastructure to not only harness it and maintain it, but also to corner it, quite frankly, was all being put in place 20 some years ago, right? And so the future need state you had seen in 91 was rapidly materializing at scale, but we didn't know it because Moore's law, things just get cheaper and better and faster. And then Metcalfe's law, because 04, we finally start to dabble in social media and networks, and the web becomes readable and writable and communal. And so now we have these network effects, and they're now doubling. The spread of information, like you said, content, data, things that are being recorded somewhere on somebody's ledger, but it's not decentralized, and things that are being attached to us, right, directly or indirectly. And as that's all happening, you have this 100-year financial crisis, and it's a year after the iPhone changes the way that compute's ever going to happen again, because now we remove the keys and we open a new platform for compute. We still call it a phone, but it's the only app on the thing we don't use. But we don't know that yet. So I think that lost decade is key, because what we're trying to frame here is then Bitcoin happens, Satoshi happens. And at the time Satoshi happens, very few people cared about it then either, except for those who were in the know. But Satoshi happens October 31st, 2008. The white paper comes out. 3 of the 8 references are referencing your early work with Haber on these things. And he goes, a peer-to-peer cash system. In other words, a decentralized way to move money and have hard currency. And it was novel at the time because we had just come through a big crisis that was basically showing us there was cracks in the status quo system of centralized banking. But no one really noticed. So talk to us about what Bitcoin and Satoshi's white paper did for your thinking. Because what it did for all the rest of us, we kind of can know, right? But then there was a decade of that. So 2008 to 2018, let's call it that. What happened when Bitcoin became the blockchain, for lack of a better word, to use your vernacular?
Absolutely. Bitcoin really did, when we first read, Stuart and I, the Bitcoin white paper, we thought, this is one heck of a clever use for the basic ledger idea, distributed ledger idea that we had. And again, there were many innovations that Satoshi was adding, but more than anything, he had realized, and I'll just use he just as a shorthand forever, so
whoever they may be,
whoever he, she, whatever, had realized that this distributed system, okay, meant that he could build the trust right into the database, and that all the players in the system would agree that it was the authentic record. And he said, well, this, opens up the world for me to put all these financial transactions on this record and incentivize the different players in the system, the different nodes, for whom the key responsibility is to hold a separate copy of the record identical to all the others. Here's a great way I can incentivize them to want to hold on to those records and to keep this ball rolling. And again, Satoshi setting this whole thing free was, my hat goes off to that person for what they did. But they built it on this notion that we no longer have to think about the individual that holds the record as whether that individual is trustworthy or not. The record itself is trustworthy. And it was just very gratifying to see him grasping the essential feature of the system that we built, that the record itself is trustworthy. We no longer have to trust the person that is creating this or that block in the record. It's that the whole community knows that it's being created in a proper way, and that.
And this was one of the key things, was solving the Byzantine generals, dilemma, right? That had kind of befuddled people such as yourself and other cypherpunks for years. And this was kind of the, oh my gosh, like there was a eureka moment of here's a way to do it.
Again, it was it was a breathtaking thing for us as well as others. Okay?
Yeah. So as you look ahead, so then that was, again, same month, different date, Halloween, which we now celebrate every year as, the birthday of Bitcoin. And then the Genesis block for Bitcoin, January of 09, the early part of January of 09. So, there was this similar kind of symbiotic, now there's another Genesis block. And it's really the Genesis block that was heard around the world, if you want to look back on it that way, right? Like, it wasn't the start of it all, but it was the one that everyone recognized as, wow, something happened here, right? And so here we are today.
I want to emphasize one that we looked very favorably on, because we thought, yes, someone has finally grasped the real benefit and power of this system that had, in a sense, had its day in the sun, but kind of had languished. So It was a big step forward. We're as happy to celebrate the Bitcoin Genesis block as anyone.
Yeah, and I think, and it's and so again, as we think about now blockchain beyond Bitcoin, decentralized ledger technology, blockchain, whatever we want to call it, beyond Bitcoin, meaning let's assume now that Bitcoin has become a standard. This is not an investment conversation. It's none of that. It's just the thing is here, right? So it is now here. It's real. There's Wall Street bets left and right on it. There's publicly traded companies holding billions of dollars of it. So this is now widely accepted as a thing. Okay, so what now, right? Because it does a very limited thing. It does that thing very well, right? It does what it does very well, but it's very limited in what it does. As a currency, it's focused. As a blockchain, as an infrastructure, right? It's got a lot of potential and it could do a lot of other things, but what should it do? What can it do? And now there's all these other chains. There's other innovations. There's proof of stake. There's proof of so where do we go from here? And what is your focus now? Like, what are you guys excited about now or looking to support now, just in general, as it relates to those standing on your shoulders and on Satoshi's shoulders?
Well, again, what I love is the flourishing beyond Bitcoin of the blockchain concept, because it's the fundamental flourishing that says, now that we have a layer of trust for any kind of records that we want to create, okay, what new, not just apps, but effectively what new social institutions can we build on top of this? And obviously, I think it goes without saying, but I'll mention it anyway, that the whole concept of embedding smart contracts into the blockchain was a huge step forward, okay? And my hat goes off to those, early players, the Ian Griggs, the Nick Szabos, and Vitalik, and others that tried to make it real. Even J.R. Willett, I think, is an unsung hero in that space, in developing the ICO concept where something can piggyback on top of another blockchain. But to more fully answer your question about where it goes, I think we underestimate that for many institutions, their foundational power comes from the fact that we had to trust someone to keep a certain record. And while it has been slow to be grasped, many of these institutions their existence is going to become questioned when we realize that there are other ways to trust collectively the records that we keep as individuals, as people. And we're going to see a slow and then rapid taking away of the foundations from some of these institutions and being replaced by systems that build directly on the individual people and holders of the records. You're seeing a democratization of institution.
And I think, so if we go with that narrative earlier of where there was that dark ages, or that seemingly dark decade of 97 through 08, where you'd kind of foreshadowed, you kind of invented some of this stuff, and it didn't really look like much was going on. And then all of a sudden, boom, Satoshi. And then there's a couple of years, but then that kind of gets to a thing. And now we have this whole industry, and, it's still small in comparison, but it's a $2-3 trillion industry, depending on the day. NFTs went to 25 billion this year. They were at 150 million last year. So, and we go, oh my gosh, like, is that over? Is that a bubble? And it's like, that's not even, if you think about what a tokenization of a thing of value on a ledger that can be trusted is, 25 billion is nothing, right? Like, we're talking about, right. We're literally going to tokenize every single thing on the planet. It's the new, I explain it in a dumb way of, it's the shipping container for the digital world. What shipping containers did for moving goods across oceans more efficiently to get them on and off boats and increase the global economy, tokenization and non-fungibles will do for everything, right? And so,
yeah, and I do want to come down clearly on one side of this issue versus the other. This is not a bubble, okay? This is the harbinger of moving all assets into a universal record that we all can view as on an equal footing. Okay.
Yeah.
All the assets are going to become publicly registered on here.
And I think so
starting point.
Yeah, and so I think, if we go, what I like to say to people a lot is, and you've heard me say it a couple of times, we've had several conversations like this, but the cement has been poured, right? So to your point, this isn't a bubble. That doesn't mean there won't be speculative ups and downs or volatility. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, this is not a fad. This is not a trend that's going to phase out. Like, this is a fundamental shift in how everything will exist, period. Full stop. I agree with you there. Others could debate us, but I agree with you there. And in that event, the cement to enable that has been poured. The thing I like to say is, this decade will be when it gets dry. So the opportunity that I see,
kind of like that, Chris. That's
is that is that if the 97, now I'm using your dark decade, I'm going, well, if 97 to 08 was the dark decade where a lot of stuff was happening that needed to happen before any of this would even be feasible, right? You can't climb a tree to the moon kind of thing. But if that was happening, then that was like the equivalent of if I'm building a massive structure with you, we're putting in footing and we're putting in wrought iron and we're flattening dirt, right? And that was that decade, right? We were putting in the footing. And then from 08 till now, people were pouring cement, but the cement's not dry yet, which means the chance for us, humanity, the chance for us to hopefully get the future more right than wrong is not whether we can reverse the fact that cement's been poured. In other words, data is more than oil, more than uranium, more than anything else. It is a weapon and a tool, right? It is the only commodity that there will increasingly be more of, and that at the same time will increasingly become more valuable because our ability to refine it will become increasingly better, exponentially. So it is a commodity that has never existed in the history of humankind. And it's both scarce and abundant, right? And so if that's the case, then the inevitable, to the name of the event, right, to the summit each year, the inevitable future is that's going to govern all. But the way it happens, the cement, the things in the cement, the ability to put our fingerprints in it, how much is peer-to-peer, how much is decentralized versus centralized, how much is co-opted by the status quo versus innovated by a whole new community, that's now. And maybe till 2030, maybe till 2035. That's now.
Hard to call that will go, but it's definitely now. And I guess I would offer one analogy and then make one comment that goes maybe a little contrarian to some of the buzz today. The first analogy I'd offer is I think many people today have an understanding, having watched the evolution of open source software. Okay, mm-hmm. The idea that you put software into a common pool, people improve on it, they can download it, they can make use of it. And so it creates these great ecosystems. It was viewed so askance at first because people said, well, open source software means it's free and the ownership of it is becoming distributed and spread out. How can anyone make any money if it's free? And they were missing an essential point. They were missing the fact that when you grease the skids of the economy and decrease the friction, okay, yeah, it allows value creation around that object, okay? Now, what's the blockchain got to do with open source software? The blockchain is a successor to that. It's open source data. It's data that now can be jointly viewed and possessed by everyone. And so some people will say, well, doesn't that mean that the data is available for free? And how can anyone build something, a sustainable economic model? And the answer is the same way they did it with open source software. Okay, we've now got these uniform standard of data in a sense that everyone's agreeing on. And there's tremendous opportunity to build value on top of that. That's my first statement. Mm-hmm. The second one is we're in an age, at least this month, where everyone wants to talk about a Web 3.0 and how that's going to create a more equitable and decentralized ownership structure. That means that we won't have these enormous concentrations of power on Amazon or a Facebook or whatever. There, I take a slightly different view. The good news is it's a new frontier, it's up for grabs, and there's plenty of ways to innovate and be an early starter, come out of nowhere and make a name for yourself, so to speak. But the idea that from here on out, unlike everything else in history, there will be no more centralization or accumulation of concentration of ability and power and whatnot. I just don't see it flowing that way. Yeah, it's a new chapter, it's a new chance, but to think that it's always going to stay flat.
Well, and I think you bring up an interesting thing that I'd like to make a point on too, because it's not, it doesn't have to be. Nothing in this world that we call real life, meaning the physical universe that we don't understand but participate in, nothing is fully centralized or decentralized, right? Like, in other words, there's 8 planets or whatever there are. There's one sun. We don't have our own sun. That wouldn't work. We'd be too close to it, and then we wouldn't be able to exist, right? So centralization plays a key role for certain things. Decentralization plays a certain role. Our human bodies aren't even fully decentralized because we have a central nervous system. We have a brain. We lose this brain, we're done, right?
I would often argue that my body is decentralized because my brain and my mouth aren't connected.
Well, or they probably would have the same laugh on both of us if they ever got together. So but the point is, our wives' opinions aside, when I cut myself shaving, right, peer to peer, the cells interact and they fix the scab. Like, I don't have to engage. I don't have to shut down my lungs. Nothing else stops. But peer to peer decentralization works really well in Mother Nature, and Mother Nature also inherently means that there has to be an interoperability between decentralized systems and functions and centralized ones. The thing that we're all after is just an equitable future, and an equitable future means that the most powerful and enriching resource on the planet of currently 7.8 billion people, that each one of us produces in 2018, at least 10 gigabytes of waste every 10 minutes in a 24-hour day. And that's 4 years old data. That was before 5G. That was before, the latest, greatest phone you have with a bigger screen and bigger bandwidth, right? So whatever the heck that number is now is way bigger, exponentially bigger. But every single human being is producing the same amount, whether they have a device or 3, on a statistical basis. And yet 4 billion of us are still unconnected, right? 2.5 billion of us are still undocumented, not participating in the commercial cycle. There's whole countries that can't get dollar swaps. And so what we're not talking about is like you said, a binary solution where it's pure decentralization or centralization. We're talking about is, let's look at Mother Nature, who always wins, because we've only been here for about 10,000 years of recorded history, and it's been here for billions of years. And let's build our systems around that. My good friend Mickey McManus wrote a book years ago called Trillions, and he talked about Trillions Mountain, and it was kind of in 2011 talking about how Trillions Mountain is when you have trillions of interconnected smart devices learning from each other, learning from us, connected to each other, and it creates a different sense, a different environment for each of us at scale. And you're not going to get where we are to there. Like, you're not going to get there from here. So you have to re-architect the entire system of how you think about a connected world in Web3. It's not about whether Facebook's still here or not, right? That's not the point. And I agree with you on that. It's what role will they play, and how will they connect into a more open and democratized system? And how will someone in Zimbabwe or Zanzibar participate in a way they've never been able to? And how will we unlock trillions of dollars or quadrillions of dollars of new economic activity in a more equitable fashion than we've ever been able to do before? And that's the cement that I'm saying is wet, that is either now or never. We either solve that, or we all become house pets to the AI. That's the binary equation I see.
Okay, well, I know that the house pets to the AI takes us off on another thread.
That'll be for Rich and Gertzel to talk about. Yeah. So let's talk about immutable record. So we've done a good job. I think you have something I want to talk about that you're trying to do with the future. You and Stuart are putting together this effort to kind of put something cemented in writing that kind of honors the past, highlights the present, and foreshadows the future. And it's a celebration of sorts. And so speak to that kind of paper that's coming up and where that sits. And then we'll talk a little bit about immutable record, and I'll kind of tell people what's going on with that.
Sure. So again, when we got to this 30th anniversary of that early proto-primitive blockchain, we felt that it was important not only to anchor kind of our place in this progression, but also use it to reflect on all of the progress that others have contributed, and to try to build a kind of, in the spirit of blockchain, something with multiple participants who have really helped move the whole blockchain system forward. We'd like to talk about creating a kind of unified consensus amongst them about where we think things are now headed. And we've come up with a novel way to link these different celebration events together. I don't want to put the whole cat out of the bag, but you're going to see a blending of early players, current players as well as where we think the future is headed into a collective celebration that's going to be documented, again, in a way that everyone's going to find out a little bit more about real soon.
And again, I think the purpose of this is what's interesting. So, there's this kind of new manifesto that's in the works that you're talking about that'll be part of this celebration, but there'll be a physical thing or whatever, a physical shareable digital thing that comes out of that is a body of work. And that body of work will have the mental inputs of a disparate group of actors that are really enabling innovation. Yeah. And this is people that in your guys' estimation, through your own network effects and through invitations of others that you trust, are trying to organize a solid group of the best minds and current actors and people with the track records and the future vision and the current success with innovations to say, here's where we think it should go. And to kind of memorialize a document as this 30-year is kind of here that paints a picture that we can look back on 30 years from now and go, how right did we get it? How right was it? How on was it? And to kind of take the religion out of the industry, because this is not about, this chain, that chain. You guys are trying to, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, you guys are doing the work that no one else really can do, which is to take your position as quote unquote the godfathers of the entire industry, for lack of a better word, and say, hey, do your thing, compete, innovate, go all in, drink the blue versus the red, whatever you're doing with this chain or that chain. However, remember the big picture. We're not competing with each other.
Right.
We're competing against the past. We're competing against the inequities of the present. We're competing against a world of silos that we tried to tear down with the internet that have now become weaponized and even bigger, and now are existential threats. We're competing against that. Just like Elon said years ago, I'm not competing with electric car makers. I'm competing with gas. Like, you're taking a similar role, but from a different lens, and saying, we want to highlight everybody, even if other people think that they don't get along, because we don't care.
Right.
We just
we really need to see that we share so much more common ground in advancing this agenda than, tribalism about this blockchain or that blockchain or whatnot. And I got to say that I hope this is something that people are hearing what you've said over the last 2 minutes, because it's inspirational to me the way you've described it. And
well, I mean, you guys are doing it. I'm just explaining how
I know, but you've captured the words. Maybe you should be running for office someplace.
No, thank God. No, I'm going to stay. I'm going to stay right here with you, my friend. I'm going to do the work I know how to do best, which is this. And just try and put a hat in the ring and put our own fingers at our company in the cement to make it a better place alongside of you and others. So,
well, I think I'm not going to let you off that hook too easy that easily. That's the point of a peer-to-peer system, is that the Chris Snooks of the world and people like you can make the contributions to advance this front. We can work in a peer-to-peer fashion and recognize our collective contribution.
Well, and I think, as we wind up this talk, I think, we've talked about the prehistory, which I think is super informative. I even know as many times as we've talked and whatever, I learned stuff that I hadn't thought about before in this conversation. So I know everybody else did. The contextualization of what Bitcoin was and means and did for it, and also that it's a node, that it's a piece in time, and that it's a massive proof point, and it's here to stay. And yet the real work has just begun. And the real work that's just begun is now going to be hopefully celebrated in a way that honors tribalism, but doesn't advance it in one regard or another, which is what I think is unique about what you and Stuart Haber are doing with Immutable Records. So for those who are interested in more of this, one of the things we can let out of the bag is go to immutablerecord.com, because there's talk of this celebration. There's a timeline that talks to a lot of these key artifacts, the New York Times thing. These things are being put together in a way that will allow people to participate, both from the industry as well as from without the industry, as a collector, as a participant, as a node of celebration and activation, to bring this purpose and passion that you guys have to light, and to advance this industry wherever it's destined to go in a better direction over the next 30 years. So for that end, do you have anything else you want to plug as we're here? immutablerecord.com. Scott Stornetta, I'll let you close us out.
Well, I'm just going to offer just a little tease that there will be something in the NFT space that people can participate in, but that will be novel and unlike any NFT that people have seen before. In a sense, the world's first decentralized NFT.
And I'm going to hold my tongue because I know more than I can say about it, but I will tell you that I would definitely, wherever they go, immutablerecord.com, I would definitely subscribe or follow or register for an alert on whatever that is when it's coming, because we're fortunate enough to kind of know some of what's happening and participate in it. And I can tell you that I think it's going to be a really interesting and unique way to demonstrate not only the power of community and peer-to-peer, but the power of this innovation, this power of this technology. And you guys, once again, are innovating in interoperability in a way that others are only talking about. So we'll leave it at that.
Yep.
Scott, I appreciate you, man. Thank you so much. All the best. Thanks for being here at Inevitable World Summit 2022. Thanks for being here with us during the World's Fair Expo 2020 celebration from the Bulgarian Pavilion at Expo 2022, New Jersey. We wish you the best, and thank you for being here, sir.
Yeah, and a real pleasure each time we interact, Chris. Thanks again.
Take care.